Let me ask you something. If you commit the ultimate offence, do you deserve the ultimate punishment? Today's topic, we're going to be talking about the death penalty.
What if everything you think you know about reality is wrong? What if the glitches, the mysteries, and the unanswered questions are clues from conspiracies and the paranormal to science, consciousness, and the possibility we're living in a simulation? This is the One Opinion in 8 billion podcasts. Every week, we dive into the biggest mysteries of our world. Subscribe now and be a part of the discussion. Question everything. Nothing is off limits.
Hi everyone, welcome to the next episode of One Opinion in 8 billion. So as already said, today I'm going to talk about the death penalty. This is following on from the last podcast where I ran out of time because chat. So I'm going to try and keep this one brief and just do on the death penalty today. So that's the big question, and it's one of those controversial questions where it is very much split down the middle. Those that are for and believe in the death penalty and those that are against. So when I've mentioned it in my book, the way that I've done everything in my book is I've looked at things logically. So I've tried to look at the pros and the cons, take both arguments into accountability, and then come up with my own version. So straight off the bat, I am for the death penalty. I believe that the punishment should be that of fitting the crime. And now a lot of people that are opposed to the death penalty say that life imprisonment and the trauma or the pain and suffering of living in a 6x8 or 6x6 cell for 23 hours a day or whatever is a harsher punishment, whereas death penalty is a quick punishment. It's over with. But for me, life is precious. Life's got more hard times than it has good, and it is a struggle, but it's still a privilege. It doesn't matter why we're here, how we got here. It's still an honour and a privilege. And for you to then take someone's life, you should have to forfeit yours, because the pure privilege of breathing life is the honour that you should have taken away, because you've done that to somebody else and affected so many other lives. That being said, there are some stipulations into my accountability for the death penalty, which I'll go into in a moment. But first of all, let's talk about the actual death penalty itself. So over the years, the death penalty has probably been in most countries at one point or another. And as legislation has changed and as we've grown and modernised and become more civilized, it's been less used, or it's been taken away as capital punishment in the country, such as the UK where I'm from. Ours used to be hanging, and that was predominantly stopped, I think, because there have been so many, and this is another big issue with those opposed, so many, let's call them mistakes, but it's the same as I've said in other podcasts, that we can only go on what we know at the time. So, there's one particular one that I remember, and I can't remember for the life of me what his name was, but it was a serial killer in London called John Halliday Christie, and he used to basically brutally abuse his skills that he was some form of medic during World War II, and he would offer his services to ladies to have abortions, which were prohibited at the time. And he used to live on a very famous road called 10 Reddington Place, which has actually changed names now because of obviously what's happened. But he used to basically say that he would help them with an abortion, and he would put them under anaesthetic, sexually assault them, and then normally strangle them. And he had a flat above. He had a wife who lived with him, But when she was out of work, he would be doing these actions because I think it didn't work because he claimed that he was injured from the war. But anyway, this young couple moved in, and they had a very young baby, and the male was a little bit simple. He was, now he would probably, well, I'm pretty sure he'd be diagnosed with like autism of some sort or some sort of learning, deformity of sorts. And this was taken advantage of by John Halliday Christie because they were a struggling couple with a newborn. And long story short, she ended up getting pregnant again. And she confided whilst her husband was at work in Christie. And he had basically, in a roundabout way, offered his services to help. So he ended up discussing it with her a few times, and then with the husband, and the husband, and her agreed to it, etc., etc. Anyway, so what's happened is he's obviously done his normal routine with her whilst the husband's at work, and when the husband's come back, Christie has again used his disability against him by saying to him that that it was a risk, and unfortunately she'd passed away, and that subsequently, because no care for the baby, that the baby had suffocated or choked or something along those lines. Anyway, when the police were involved, because he in his mind had agreed to the operation knowing the risks, he has openly said to the police, again, I am abbreviating a lot here, but he'd basically admitted that it was his fault, that he'd done it. Now that, however long ago it was pretty compelling evidence. And long and short of it was that in his mind, he was admitting to the fact that they died because of his agreement to the operation, which was never mentioned. And he was subsequently hung. And I think it was 25 or 27 years later. I think it was Timothy something, but he was later found and acquitted after John Halliday Christie had been, found out, tried, convicted, and then so many years later, the gentleman that had sort of admitted it was pardoned. Now, the opposers of the death penalty are very much, which I agree with, it's irreversible. And I think that's the key word when it comes to the death penalty. It's irreversible. But then, you've got, as the years have gone on, the death penalty has also gone through a humane, again, as we've civilised, they've changed it from being somewhat brutal executions to more civilised ones. So to give you an example, if you don't, if you do know, if you don't know, but like in the UK, it used to be beheading by either an axe or sword, generally depending on male, female, and class. And then that obviously evolved into the hanging. We used to have even more brutal. We used to have for very high treason and those incredibly bad for the state. We used to have hung, drawn, and quarter, where they would literally hang you, stretch you, and cut you open and disembowel you whilst you were alive, and then behead you to cause maximum pain. Which, a lot of people would argue that, if they're getting that punishment, they deserve the pain, right? But we're in a civilised society, so, that crosses the boundary with vigilantism. So, taking, our own personal feelings into, onto the punishment, which is where obviously the difference between civilised and uncivilised is. So, but then, in more modern times, you've had the guillotine in France, you've had firing squads, which are still going today, where, a line of 10 people will line up and literally just take aim on you and shoot. But then you've got America. And America's got a whole different variety of current in use death penalties. So you've only got one now, I think, which is in Utah, that used the gas chamber. Not sure how often it's used, but it's very inhumane for me. It's, you're suffocating, you're gassed. So for me, I'm a bit unsure as to why that one's even still being used. Then you've got another very popular one that was used throughout the States, the electric chair. Again, I suppose it's quite hard to know the pain and suffering you undergo during electrocution, whether or not your brain's just so fried that you're not even aware of what's going on. But the fact is, we don't know. But if anyone's ever had an electric shock, which is probably nowhere near the same, but you get the idea of what I'm trying to say, is that the pain it's not pleasant. So one could argue that, having a shooting bolts of lightning going through your brain probably isn't the nicest or the most humane. So I'm a bit unsure why that's still being used. Now, they've got a much more humane one now, which I think most people, especially those that agree with the death penalty, would say it's probably the most humane way of going about it, which is similar to euthanasia, or when animals and stuff are put down. So they're given a course of normally 3 injections, different chemicals in them. I think one puts you to sleep, one paralyses you, and one stops your heart. But it's done in such a way that you're essentially going painless. You're being essentially put to sleep like anaesthetic. So I think most would agree that that's probably the best modern way to what we know of doing it. So that covers the general basis of the death penalty. The reasons. So I am for it, but with slight exemption, slight tick boxes that need to be achieved before I feel that that it should go ahead, to ensure in a very high percentage that the likelihood that they were wrong would be next to none. So, for instance, we've in modern science, modern technology, modern forensics, we've got DNA, we've got fingerprints, we've got CCTV, which is a massive one. So, for me to put a story out there, if you are somebody that has sexually assaulted and killed someone, left DNA, and it was caught on CCTV, that for me is beyond a reasonable doubt of a jury, which I've talked about needs tweaking because it's not 100% effective overall. It does work to a degree, and it does work in a high percentage, but it could be better. And where things could be better, we should always strive for it to be better. So let's just say that you were caught red-handed on camera, the jury found you guilty, and there's DNA proof and CCTV proof. That for me is pretty compelling. And then there should be like an addendum. So you've been found guilty, and then it should be sort of another, push forward if you wish for the death penalty. And that should be where the jury then look at there's enough evidence to find them guilty of the crime, but is there enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they deserve to have their life forfeited for their crimes? We're talking about some of the serious crimes. If we look at people like, some of the famous serial killers in time, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, etc. These are the worst of the worst. These people are never going to be rehabilitated. They wouldn't even rejoin society anyway, because their term would supersede most people's life terms or lifespans. But for me, those are the people that should be executed, and I do feel strongly about it. And I don't say it lightly, because I know that there has been many mistakes, if you collectively over the world over the years, and many injustices, in medieval time when we were less civilized than we are today. And I'm sure in 1,000 years or 100 years, 500 years, they'll be even more civilized than we are. Well, I hope to think that we'd be more civilized and advanced. and things might change again. But as things currently stand in the 21st century, in 2026, I believe that the death penalty should be in every country. As a deterrent, right? That's what that's one of the reasons why we have these punishments, is to deter people from committing in the first place, or especially re-offending. After their punishment, they think, "Oh, I don't want to do that again." So for me, if you've taken a life, your life should be forfeited, because purely taking breath is a privilege, and you've denied that from someone and ruined so many people's families. So that's my stance on it. Whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent, like I've said, is there a right or wrong? It's a personal perspective. So I do agree with it, but with some tweaks. I don't believe that, it's, you're found guilty of murder. Do we think the death penalty? Yes. I don't think it should be like that. I think it needs to have, specific guarantees that show that you are guilty of that crime, and that you deserve the ultimate punishment. But I'd love to know your guys' thoughts. The idea of the podcast, I am trying to find my flow and my audience, and what keeps you guys interested, and I'm trying not to babble on, which I've done even in this episode. But that's where I'm going to leave it today, because I'm trying to keep them short, even though I haven't been successful in that yet, and maybe just do stepping stones of questions like this, and maybe just one each podcast, for a few episodes, and then maybe go back to conspiracies. But I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on whether you agree with the death penalty, disagree with it, your reasons for either side, or if you share any similar views to what I'm saying, that you are on the fence, more leaning towards pro, but with conditions. But let me know, and see you for the next one, guys. Take care.
Thanks for watching the One Opinion in 8 Billion podcast. The truth is rarely simple, but the questions are always worth asking. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe and join the conversation, because the biggest questions in life deserve to be explored.